I'm actually quite ashamed of some of the things. We had these women's clubs, and we did a lot of nutrition and things like that in that. And also a certain amount of leadership training of different kinds. One found oneself getting into all sorts of strange things, like teaching people to bath babies, and actually they knew much better than we did how to manage their babies and so on. But I think, the thing that I always look back on afterwards, I learned so much more from them than they ever learned from me. So it was popular education in reverse at that time. African education of these stupid whites.
And you, Sally, in your Peace Corps work, was there popular education?
No. Not really. I was teaching chemistry and biology to 240 kids.
In a school?
In a school. And only in the afternoons, and in the mornings I was doing laboratory work in a hospital nearby.
So how did popular education come into the picture for both of you?
I think that...
Well, that was working with adult groups, but still it was not terrible. It was very much helping people to get confidence that they, as Africans, could do things. They didn't need to depend on whites. So there were elements of that already there.
I want to say that Anne's work with the Christian Education Leadership Training CELT, then in the 60s, and I came across human relations training in the YWCA group process. How do you help facilitate? How do you listen? And it's kind of the leadership training that CELT was. And we were both doing it in different places of the world. And then we both ended up at Boston University in 1969.
Which had a very famous Center of Human Relations at that time with Ken Benny, a lot of people from the National Training Laboratories, which were doing a lot of that kind of analysis of group processes and the dynamics in group work and group leadership.
So I'm interested in the jump from chemistry to
but then it was civil rights, and then it was so a lot of justice stuff. But then we both got very interested in group process work. But then that's 1969, and who by chance comes to Harvard University at Cambridge, which is right next to Boston University or nearby, but Paula Furr.
But the CELT work was extremely important to me. CELT really swept through the churches in South Africa, the mainline churches. Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist, particularly were involved. And I went first in 1966 to a program. It was started about 1964, I think, with 2 American Anglican priests. No, one South African, David Point, and Don Griswold. And they started this whole process, but they were already influenced by this group process stuff from the States. And so they had these tea groups of 12 people with 2 trainers in, and they'd get you into a room together. You had to commit yourself to being there full time for a week, at least 40 hours it was going to be. And we sat in a room and they did nothing. They said, we're here simply to look at what are the dynamics involved in group processes. And the only way to learn is experientially, so go ahead. And they left it. They were the most agonizing periods. And gradually all sorts of people did this. You sit there, everybody would wait for somebody to show some leadership, and then people would start to show a little leadership, and almost invariably they'd be pounced on and that kind of stuff. And then every now and then the 2 trainers, there was 2 trainers, and I afterwards doing a lot of training, they said, let's just stop and look at what has happened. And then we would look back on what had happened and why it had happened and all that. Everything had to be entirely in the here and now. Nobody was allowed to tell stories from outside at all. And in that whole process, you got to understand, and the bonds that grew in that process were quite phenomenal. We'd end up with such a sense of, that you knew these people better than anybody in your family that you'd ever known, and all your friends of life for ages. I can remember just some of those experiences. And I can remember that was one of the few situations in the 60s in South Africa where you had a complete mix from different religions and blacks and whites together. And then I can remember one particular tea group we had where at a particular point one of the Anglican black priests suddenly said, all we're doing here is papering over papering over cracked walls. if I meet you in the street in 2 weeks' time, are you even going to greet me? Here you make out that I'm one of your most beloved friends, but will you greet me in 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years? And I could just remember there was one person who'd been very actively involved with the Christian Institute. He was sitting in the corner, and tears were just running down his face, and the whole thing exploded. And so we would deal with questions, of trust, very deep questions of trust in that process. And it was an amazing opportunity of really just beginning to realize what black people were going through from some of the few really articulate black people who were around at that point. But what was amazing about it was it built a quality of trust that really enabled people to speak. People knew they'd be heard. People knew that in that situation. And so we were able to work through a lot of very, very difficult issues in that process. I learned a huge lot from it.
And so I have been going through some of this T group stuff in the States as well, and these group processes thing. So I just think
yeah, and so it was because of that process that I was doing a lot of training, but I wanted further training myself. And we heard about the Human Relations Center at Boston University, and so I
But then talk about how you heard about Paulo Freire.
Creole people in Brazil had worked with Paulo Freire in the movement for democratic, what was it called? Movement for Basic Education. And so they'd been involved with him there. And then he had spent some time in Portugal, and Grail people there had been involved with him in a whole program for farmers and fishermen that he was doing there. And so then we began to hear from these people about this fantastic process of Paulo Freire's. And so I went to Boston, determined to find out as much as I possibly could about that. And so then I joined the Boston Theological Institute. They had 7 different colleges connected with it, and picked out all the courses which were in any way related to what Freire was doing, and Ivan Illich and all those sort of people.
And when just and like then, 2 weeks, no, before that, anyway, but like 2 weeks after you and I had met in the first class at Boston University, group adult education.
Jim Lamb and Dennis Goulet told us that
there was an institute at Harvard, and they said, would you like to join the seminar with Paulo Freire? And Anne then jumped and dragged me along. And then we got into huge trouble. We then were doing anti-racism work, because racism had exploded in the States after Martin Luther King had been killed. And so we were working with people on white, because the issue of racism is a white problem, not a black problem. So we were developing all kinds of methodologies of helping white people, and we were hired by the National YWCA to do this white-on-white anti-racism work. And we were developing it through this participatory method of Freire and figuring out all kinds of codes and methods and stuff like this. We showed it to Malcolm Knowles from the Adult Education Department, and he said, this is awful. You're pushing people to go to a certain direction. No, he said, we were pushing people to think, and he said, you can't do that. He was a Rogerian, which is, that it's
non-directive, yes.
And so, therefore, if someone says the Ku Klux Klan is really, really onto something very important, and you would sit there and say, "Oh, that's interesting," you couldn't say, "Does everyone agree? Is this really true?" Or, challenge. But so that's.
But I'd also been in the Christian Institute with Beyers Naudé in South Africa, and so that before I went to Boston. So that had also deepened all the time the sense of the injustice and the very great importance of change. So I went there, really looking for how does one effectively help people to start changing
But I do think,
their situation.
I hadn't thought of this, but I do think that our work on that white-on-white stuff
it was good.
Was really kind of our putting into practice the methodology in a very middle-class, United States situation. And how do you use a participatory method to unlock
But then
stuff.
also at the same time, the YWCA was getting more and more radical. And they we were facilitating a couple of their national meetings.
The white
point.
They separated out blacks, people of color,
and whites, yes, but there were blacks there. But then they passed this motion on to get rid of...
The one imperative to eliminate
racism wherever it exists and by whatever means necessary, which was a Stokely Carmichael phrase. This was in the 1969, yes. That was the age of the Black Panthers in the United States.
And any means necessary meant violence. We said, why? What, any means necessary? Couldn't it mean that you buy from black people? Oh, you know, by any means necessary. How do you shift? Yeah.
So then Boston, and then from Boston you came here.
Then we went to Swaziland.
No, then I couldn't get in here.
No, she couldn't.
I had been doing anti-apartheid work.
Yes, so Sally was.
I think it was the Polaroid campaign.
Yes.
And that's where my name got on the list.
Yes, so her name was on the blacklist of South Africa. So then we went, I found when I got back here, I had to come back after that because I didn't have a visa, to stay. I only had a student visa for 2 years. So I came back and I talked to Colin Collins, who was really the first person who ever did work of Paulo Freire in South Africa.
Okay.
He was
He's now in Australia.
Australia, but he was a Catholic priest. He ran teachers' formation workshops all over the place, which were very significant in the lives of a whole generation of teachers, black teachers.
Pick up.
And he said, "Oh, look, there's a guy down in Swaziland who's interested in Paulo Freire." And I was going down to one of the Kilt meetings in the town, so I went via Swaziland. And he said, and you were going to work for Frontier Internship.
Oh yes, when.
And you had gone to that thing in.
No, wait a minute. Let's back up. So I couldn't get in. I couldn't get into South Africa. They had turned me down, but I had gotten money from the Presbyterian Church that had something called the Frontier Internship, and they had agreed to me working here in South Africa with Anne. Whatever, and doing Freire work, I think.
Yes, we were going to do Freire work together in South Africa.
I couldn't get in. So I still went to 3 weeks with Paulo Freire in his institute at Geneva, because he was at that time with the World Council of Churches. So I was there, but never thinking I could get into South Africa, so I didn't know. And then Anne.
And then I wrote or telephoned. What did I do? Did I write or telephone?
No, you went to Swaziland.
I know,
you said
but
Ross
and Ross Kidd said, "Oh, if she's already got funding, she can certainly work here." And I had a job then working with the Christian Institute, and so I had a salary. And Bayers completely agreed that I could work wherever it seemed sensible to work. Anything there. Amazingly trusting. If I wanted to work in Swaziland, as far as he was concerned, part of the time that was fine.
So I had packed a suitcase in Geneva, or to go to Geneva for 3 weeks, and then I get the phone call from Anne.
We can both work in Swaziland. Why don't you come right away?
So I flew via Lisbon to then Lorenzo Marx, and then over to Swaziland, because we didn't want me to go through
South Africa.
Through South Africa.
And they caught up with us 9 months later. Took them 9 months to catch us, and then they threw Anne out. We did a lot of work then.
So what kind of application? I'm wanting the popular education work.
But this is where we adapted.
Very much popular education.
This is where we adapted.
By this time, we were really very much saying, how do we adapt Freire's approach to South Africa?
But in Swaziland, what we were, and so there were two things. Anne was working in South Africa, I couldn't. And in Swaziland, we connected up with Sabenta, which was a literacy program with UNESCO funding. And they said, yes, come and train our trainers and develop the literacy materials. And so we did the whole shoot match of the surveys, the generative themes.
And I drove every week, 1 week down in Swaziland, 1 week in Johannesburg.
And so then we'd set up these, so they'd go do the surveys, they'd come back with the words, and they'd come back with the themes, and we developed a whole literacy program in Siswati.
Developed all the question outlines, developed that
everything,
kind of
the whole literacy program with 32 words. And Swazi has twa, P, B, F, W,
lots of
A,
Fs.
rather than B-A, fwa.
Instead of Abantu, Abwan, no, yes, so the Fs they put in. And
F and a W.
Anyway,
so it was difficult in their language to do this. But so then we had all the materials ready, working with the Sabenta staff, et cetera, et cetera. We're out there training about 200, 150 teachers and the police.
Yeah, but before that.
Yeah, but just let me finish that one. The police come in and say, "Anne Hope, please." She's in front of the group. Pull her out, says, you got 2 days to get out. And we discovered that the Swazi police was controlled by the South African police by a colonel named Colonel Roach, like cockroach. And I didn't get put out for 2 more weeks. And no, we met then.
But we also were we were beginning to become feminists. Well, from the time in Boston, we got very interested also in feminism. And so one time we had a group, there were only 8 students at the university.
8 women students.
8 women students and a few wives of staff who were there. And so Martin Franzmann, who was talking about oppression and liberation, said he thought it was not right that he, a white person, should be talking to black women.
Economics teacher.
Economics teacher. So Martin Franzmann was very active. He said, please, won't you do something with these women? So we had some meetings with the women, and then they wanted to have this open meeting to discuss the situation of women with the staff, those wives of all the staff. There weren't many women actually teaching. There were no women teaching, but the wives of the teachers. And so we had a very simple program: what you like about being a woman, what you dislike about being a woman, and what would you like to see changed in the lives of women. I mean, you couldn't get much simpler than that. And they had this meeting in a classroom that had windows on 3 sides. And they were very excited about this meeting. And just as we started the meeting, a huge protest from the men came along and said...
On the outside.
On the outside. They said, we want to come to this meeting.
No, and then they made signs.
No, but that was before.
Okay.
First they said, we want to come to this meeting. And we said, well, it's the women's meeting. It's not our meeting. You must ask the women. And the women said, no, this is a meeting for women. We're not going to have you here. And so then they went out, and then they came back with blackboards with down with foreign agitators, down with, what was it, imperialist, yes, yeah. Down with imperialist foreign agitators. And actually, I think this thing was actually one of the significant things, because Swaziland is a very, very chauvinistic, masculine culture. And so it was one of the things that I think contributed to this. We also had a very good friend who was a Bishop Zwane, in Mbaban. And so one time he said, look, I want to take you out for a drink down to the place down there, the main pub where all the parliamentarians, he wanted to take us there. He said, do you know that the rumor is going around that you are part of a conspiracy of the World Council of Churches with Paulo Freire to overthrow the South African government. Now, this was such an absurd thing. I mean, there was no way that
we said yes.
Go on.
Don't we wish?
We wished we could, but we wouldn't. So he just wanted to show, look, he was a good friend of ours. But that wasn't sufficient. They didn't trust that. And so then suddenly the next thing was. And the other thing was we were going to get all the groups in South Africa who were getting involved in this Paulo Freire stuff, because there were groups in all sorts of places, from Wilkespreet and from a group of domestic workers in Johannesburg and from the Federal Seminary in Alice and all those different places. They had groups that were, kind of learning, discussing about these things. We'd run groups in all those places. So we were having a conference of all the people interested in Paulo Freire's approach in Swaziland. And then they suddenly said...
They sent a telegram to everyone to say...
Yeah, they said we had to cancel the meeting because it was too close to elections, and so it was going to be too dangerous, too hot a subject, so we had to cancel. So literally, 2 days before, we had to send telegrams to all the people to tell them not to come.
And about 3 weeks later is when she got...
And then 3 weeks later.
And this was when?
This was 1972. 71.
2.
71. Because then in 72 was the year I did work with Steve Biko and all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they sent you home?
So I had to go back to South Africa, yes. And Sally had a couple more weeks, and then they came and sent her out. So she had to go back, and she had a return ticket to Lorenzo Marx, you see. So she went to Lorenzo Marx.
No, but then
we met in Lorenzo Marx. It was the only place where we could meet at that time.
And we were followed by the special branch.
Followed everywhere by the special branch.
Mozambique. And so then Anne had to go back because her visa was gone, or her passport was running out. And so then
Oh yes, my passport was expiring right at that time. And so I went through the passport, and he looked at the passport and said, oh, this passport expires today. So I said, yes, I know, that's why I'm coming today.
But then I had to go via Johannesburg for some reason, and I was told I could get out of the airport, and she was told she could go into the transit lounge, and so then there was nowhere we could meet in the glass at the International.
Thick glass, you know, the thing.
And so we couldn't hear each other, all we could do is see each other.
I remember the glass from people getting deported.
Yes,
That's where you
that's
said
right.
Exactly.
That's
And
right.
so then I found a payphone, and I
Wrote
copied
the number of the telephone in there,
gave it
and
to
I
her.
went to another payphone, and we talked to each other through by telephone
For
from
about
one
an
side
hour.
of the transit lounge to the outside.
And
of
then
the
you went
transit
back to the States.
I went via Kenya,
Kenya.
and then Egypt, and there was a long story then Paris, and then back to the States.
And you went back
back
to Johannesburg.
Johannesburg. And yes, and
Were
then
you working for the
funnily
Council
enough-
of Churches then?
No,
Or-
Christian
No,
Institute.
Christian
Christian
Institute.
Institute.
Yes, I was working all that time with the Christian Institute. Yeah.
And she got her new passport. The passport had expired. She got a new passport. 3 weeks later,
They took it away. They came and, came to my office and gave me a letter from the Minister of the Interior saying that my passport had been withdrawn and I was to go and fetch it. I said, of course I haven't got it here. They said, we'll take you home. Popped me into the car and took me home without asking where I lived or anything. Well, they'd been tapping all our letters and phone calls and things. They knew perfectly well where I lived.